So our presenter today is Mr. Alex Wilson, who for more than 30 years has been one of the most trusted voices on energy efficiency and environmentally responsible design and construction. Mr. Wilson is the founder and guiding light of Building Green, less so today, I guess, but I'll speak about that perhaps. He is Building Green is the consulting and information company that produces buildinggreen.com. It's a source that the VCT faculty finds in many of our research paper bibliographies. So Mr. Wilson is a noted author. His work includes Your Green Home, the Consumer Guide to Home Energy Savings. He is co-author of the Rocky Mountain Institute's comprehensive textbook, Green Development, Integrating Ecology and Real Estate, as well as having published quite literally hundreds of articles in multiple AEC publications. Mr. Wilson has served as executive director of NESE, Northeast Sustainable Energy Association. He has served on the board of directors of U.S. Green Building Council and was a founding member of U.S. GBC Research Committee. In 2008, Mr. Wilson received the U.S. Green Building Council's Leadership Award for Education. And in 2010, he became the second recipient of the prestigious Hanley Award for Vision and Leadership in Sustainable Housing. In 2012, Mr. Wilson founded the Resilient Design Institute, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing practical strategies for making buildings and communities more resilient in the face of storms, floods, heat waves, droughts, power outages, and interruptions in heating or motor fuel. I could not be more pleased to welcome Mr. Alex Wilson.
Thanks, Carl. If you want to
Yeah.
flip that over.
Let me get him into screen share here.
So it's great to be here at something in person. It's been a long 2 years of looking at people on little screens and Zoom panels. So thank you for inviting me here, Carl and Kath. So I'm going to talk this afternoon about resilient design and really looking at the need to not just mitigate climate change, not just to reduce carbon emissions to help reduce the impact of a changing climate, but also to adapt to that, to look at how we're designing our buildings and designing our communities to be more resilient.
Okay.
Are we there?
I think so.
Good. Okay. Not seeming to advance with the arrows. Try use.
I think if you just,
Use the clicker. Okay, use that.
yeah. Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm not going to say much about climate change. I expect that most of you have been following that over the last 10 years or longer. Clearly the evidence is ever more irrefutable, and the people who are denying it seem to be fewer and fewer. But we, as a result of a changing climate, we need buildings that are resistant to the damage from the various impacts of climate change. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. Buildings that protect their occupants, that are more likely to survive impacts of storms, flooding, wind, and what have you, and that significantly will maintain habitable conditions during power outages, which is a cascading impact of almost all of the disasters we face today. So, why look at resilience? for me as an avid environmentalist, going back longer than I care to admit, from the time I was a teenager in the 1960s, my motivation in focusing on resilience is using that as a motivation to get people to build greener buildings and greener communities, buildings that use less energy, that are less dependent on transportation fuels, and in so doing to reduce those carbon emissions. But for a lot of people, resilience is a safety issue, and for me it is as well. But it's even people that may not believe in climate change or may not believe the environment as high a priority as most of us probably do, they probably want to keep their families safe. So that's a motivation to build homes and housing, apartment buildings, commercial buildings, schools, hospitals that will keep their occupants safe. If in looking at the existing housing stock, we need to, we can't only be focusing on the new construction. With new buildings, the answers are pretty easy. We know how to build from the ground up buildings that are going to be net zero energy, that use mass timber and other great technologies. I loved visiting this building when it was under construction. But the existing buildings are where the real challenge happens. And when an existing building is damaged by a storm or other event, we often talk about bouncing back. Well, I like to talk about bouncing forward, to use that disturbance and the damage that may happen to a building as an opportunity to make it better in the repairs that happen. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go through some of the major impacts we are looking at with buildings and what to do about it. This is going to be pretty elementary for a lot of you, but it's a good way to review what's going on. So first, looking at wind, designing for extreme wind. And I like to show this slide. This is up in the Adirondacks, and in addition to writing about energy and the environment for years, I've written a series of books on quiet water canoeing and kayaking, and have spent a lot of time in the out of doors. And back in 1995, we were on a canoeing trip in the St. Regis Wilderness area in the Adirondacks of upstate New York. And our last night, we'd been out about 7 days, 2 young daughters, my wife and another friend. This storm came up, and my wife and I were getting ready to go out for an early morning paddle around 5:30 in the morning, and we hear this thunder in the distance, and thought, that's really odd. Who's heard of a thunderstorm at 5:30 in the morning? So we debated going out and letting it pass over, but being prudent and safety conscious, we decided to pull the boat out of the water and go back to the tents. And indeed, 20 minutes later, this massive thunderstorm came through, and we were fortunate. Some trees fell down on the island we were camped on. We were safe, but 6 people that morning were killed in the Adirondacks from falling trees. And one section of the Adirondacks, 100,000 acres, lost 60% of its tree cover. So it was a pretty dramatic event. And it's what's called a Directo. And until that event, I didn't even know the term, but it's a massive thunderstorm event that extends across the country. And this particular storm had started in the Midwest, upper Michigan, and moved east over the span of a day. It affected Western Massachusetts very heavily and Vermont, but really helped me wrap my mind around the need to design for wind. So, what do we do in designing for wind? I'm not going to spend much time on this, but there are a lot of sort of easy strategies that that any structural engineer will tell you about. Hurricane strapping, tie down components on light frame construction. We can look at more wind resistant geometries, hip roofs, for example, rather than gable roofs. Interestingly, some of the strategies to minimize wind damage, like shorter overhangs on buildings, contradict some other benefits of overhangs. I like a wide overhang to keep rain away from a building and improve its durability, and help prevent moisture from coming into through foundations. But from a wind uplift standpoint, a thinner overhang is preferential. We can look at materials, higher strength roof sheathing, the nailing schedules or screwing schedules on panel products, exterior shutters on windows. Some of the innovative building systems like mass timber and timber framing are highly resistant to wind, very strong buildings. And there's various standards we can look at, such as the fortified standards from the Institute for Business and Home Safety, IBHS, and some of the engineering codes that exist. Tornadoes are another form of wind, and this is one where for the vast majority of buildings, other than some emergency management buildings, we can't really be expecting to design for buildings that will withstand 250-mile-an-hour winds that may be experienced in tornadoes. So with tornadoes, we instead tend to look at safe rooms, spaces within buildings that can provide a safe refuge. And lest we think that tornadoes are only a problem in so-called Tornado Alley, look, that map in the last slide kind of showed that Midwestern area where tornadoes are most common. Until not too long ago, the single most deadly tornado in US history was in Massachusetts, in Worcester, 1953. So that it's rare, but we can find significant tornado activity in this part of the country. So safe rooms, there are excellent standards from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. There are also various companies that pre-manufacture safe rooms. They can be cast concrete, they can be metal fabrication. They're safe rooms made with reinforced textiles, Kevlar type materials. Some of these are site built in place, some are modular, pre-manufactured and brought in. You can look at underground safe rooms in garage spaces, for example, with a hatch getting into it. And to my knowledge, from what I've read over the years, there's never been a documented fatality of someone who's been in a properly designed safe room. The building may be totally demolished around it, like this photo shows, but the people will generally remain pretty safe. Next up is flooding, something that we need to think about not only in coastal areas where we have storm surge and sea level rise, but inland areas as well. And Western Massachusetts and Vermont, where I'm based, was heavily impacted by Tropical Storm Irene in 2011. This photo is downtown Brattleboro, Vermont, where Building Green is based. And that's Flat Street that you see on the left side of the photo along the utility poles. Off to the right, kind of behind those trees, is the Whetstone Brook, which jumped its bank. And just off to the right in this photo is a building that at the time in 2011 was fairly recently built. It was the New England Youth Theater. And it was a repurposed older kind of Butler building structure. And significantly, when that was built, they knew it was in the floodplain, but the lower level of the building was within the FEMA designated 100-year flood. It was out of the 100-year flood elevation. And so they didn't need to do anything, but the civil engineer on the project, and I was working on this project when it was in design, for energy reasons, but the engineer thought, well, even though this is, above that 100-year flood elevation, if that Whetstone Brook floods, we're going to exceed that. So one of the features they incorporated into this building are these flood barriers on all of the exterior entryways. And they're tracks that are permanently installed, and the last person to leave that Sunday morning deployed these aluminum panels that fit in these channels and get tightened into place. And lo and behold, the stream did flood its bank and came to within 1.5 inches of the top of those flood barriers. So that simple feature, which probably added a couple of $1,000s to the cost of the building, saved probably a couple of $100,000 in damage had that building been fully flooded. And it's the kind of feature that can very easily be value engineered out of a building, because it's seen as an optional expense. It's not required by code. It's not, it's not adding an amenity to the building that the occupants are going to recognize unless some problem comes up. But the owners had the wherewithal to stick with it, and certainly have benefited from that. They did go back and add another 4 inches to the freeboard on these, so looking at potential for future flooding. And flooding is is increasingly common throughout the country. We've seen over the last 50 years more intense precipitation, heavier storms. In the Northeast, a 71% increase in intense storms from 58 to 2012. And even in areas that don't get much rain, drought-prone parts of the Southwest, for example, the rain that is falling tends to be in larger dollops. It quickly, transitions from being a rain that can infiltrate the ground to one that becomes runoff and flooding. So we need to be paying attention to that. In coastal areas, the issue is much greater, and because in addition to, the flooding from precipitation, we've got storm surge. Storm surge happens when there's a coastal storm, tropical storms in particular, increase the height of the incoming tide. And that's exacerbated by sea level rise. As the glaciers are melting in Greenland and Antarctica, sea levels are rising. The projections are that we're going to see a meter or more of sea level rise over the next 100 years. And so this shows, what Florida is going to look like with just a 1 meter increase in sea level. If we look at 2 meters and then 3 meters, the state is going to be very different from what we're used to thinking of as Florida in terms of its boundaries. And flooding like this isn't limited to Florida. Along the eastern seaboard and parts of the West Coast are also going to be experiencing significant changes to the coastal zones. And interestingly, in this part of the country, the inland Northeast, we're among the best off when it comes to the changes we're going to experience over the next 50 to 100 years. So, a lot of people that are looking ahead are expecting that there will be climate refugees coming to Western Massachusetts and Vermont, from New York City or, coastal New Jersey, areas that are going to be increasingly flooded. And we're also seeing in parts of Florida today that coastal flooding is no longer limited to storm surge. We're seeing tidal flooding, where exceptional high tides are now flooding streets in parts of Florida. So that's going to become increasingly common as well. So in terms of what we do about flooding, there are a lot of strategies that depend on where you are. Elevating buildings is certainly being done, more and more commonly. I was in Westport, Massachusetts not too long ago and saw buildings that are now being elevated, and up in the Plum Island area, we saw a lot of that a month or two ago when we were up there. Using pier foundations, using breakaway walls that protect these underfloor areas, so that if floodwaters do come through, they don't take down the building, they simply flow past the partitioning. In addition to elevating buildings, we can look at elevating mechanical equipment, whether it's mechanical equipment outside the building or mechanical equipment inside the building. With Superstorm Sandy in 2012, New York City saw just extensive damage to mechanical equipment in basements. And, so since that time, there's been a lot of effort to elevate that equipment, either into penthouse floors or rooftop locations. With flood design, we talk about wet flood proofing and dry flood proofing. And, I think this wet flood proofing is kind of a funny term. It seems like an oxymoron, but it's flood proofing that's designed to let spaces get wet. So allowing floodwaters to flow through a building, whether it's through a crawl space or even a first floor of a building. And what that does is protect the hydrostatic forces that that work against a building from knocking the building down. FEMA really recommends wet flood proofing in most residential applications and in a lot of commercial applications. Unless a building has been specifically designed to withstand those hydrostatic forces, wet flood proofing is typically the desired method. One of the strategies is these intentional openings that equalize pressure within a building. These flood vents, and there are a number of manufacturers that make devices like these, the normal position is closed, but if floodwaters rise, the vents kind of lift out of a channel and are able to pivot back and forth to let water flow in or out. So a kind of an ingenious system to, in normal conditions, keep rodents out and, provide security. But then if there is a flood event, they do allow that movement of water in and out, and that equalizes pressure. We saw, I've talked to people at FEMA about this, and with Sandy in particular in New York City, where there are thousands of row houses, walk-ups that are 4 to maybe 8 stories tall, often brownstone buildings. Those are unreinforced masonry, and FEMA's very worried about those. And if we do a lot of work to keep those floodwaters from filling up those basements, during a flood, there's a lot of risk that the buildings could come down in a flood. And, significantly, when so many buildings' basements were flooded during Sandy, the strategy to fix that isn't necessarily to go right out and pump the water out of the basement. that has to be done very carefully with dewatering all of those basements at the same time. If one gets dewatered, the hydrostatic forces on the basement next door to it could knock that partition foundation wall down. So a significant issue with wet flood proofing. We also, with wet flood proofing, want to look at wettable materials. And by that, we mean materials that can get wet and dry out again without having to be replaced. So materials like polished concrete, where the structural floor slab becomes a finished floor. It also offers cost benefits, to using structure as finish. Wall materials that are tile or brick or, another material, gypsum, fiberglass clad gypsum instead of paper faced gypsum board. These types of materials, can save a lot of money if a building gets wet. If a cellulosic material gets wet, it usually has to be taken out and thrown away, dumped in a landfill because of mold growth, that happens within a day or two of a flood event. Okay, so now dry flood proofing, and that's this idea of keeping water out of a building. And there are places where that makes sense. And there are a lot of buildings where it's okay to, keep a little bit of water out, keeping a foot of water out or so, as was done in that building in Brattleboro that I showed off. This pictured here is a commercial building in Providence, Rhode Island, an older building where they retrofit these channels to, be able to apply these flood panels in advance of a flood. In buildings being built new, the entire building can be engineered to withstand, to protect, several levels of sub-basement, keeping water out. But those have to be engineered for that use right from the start. Flood proofing guidance, FEMA has great stuff that's available free. The FEMA's been one of the most amazing resources for decades. Just a wealth of information in their library resources. Boston, there's this coastal flood resilience design guidelines that came out a couple of years ago. Really good stuff, and I'd urge you to take a look at that. Now that's from the city of Boston. Okay, next up is wildfire. Wildfire is certainly something we've been hearing about a lot over the last 5 years, particularly in California. At the end of last year, that devastating urban firestorm in Colorado, made the national news and front pages just very quickly, in a matter of an hour or two, took out, close to 1,000 homes. But the more common is, wildfires, not in suburban areas, but in areas that have been developed that are an ecosystem that is typically managed by natural fires, lightning started fires. We're building in places where, maybe we shouldn't be building because of that vulnerability to wildfire, but we're doing it. And, there are ways we can learn to do it better. This map shows sort of the activity, wildfire activity over the last 10 years or so, or from 1994 to 2013 by county. You can see the risk is largely in the west, or it's greatest in the west. But as precipitation patterns change, there might be more times when we're dealing with drought and wildfire, even in eastern part of the country. So in terms of what to do about it, I mentioned IBHS earlier, the Institute for Business and Home Safety. That's the research arm of the insurance industry, the home insurance industry. And they've done really good research on fire safety and fire safe building practices. This slide, you probably can't read it too well. I guess maybe you can, but just a sampling of strategies. A lot of people assume that homes burn down in wildfires because that fire comes right up to the building and catches it on fire. More typical is that the embers well in advance of a wildfire get swept up through soffit vents in the roof at the eaves and catch the building on fire kind of from the inside. So there are simple strategies for preventing that with proper ember excluding screening on eaves. IBHS in South Carolina has an amazing research facility that I haven't yet visited, though I'd love to check it out. But they can build a full-size house in this big test chamber and then expose it to all kinds of impacts of Category 5 hurricane, driving rain, very high wind, Category 5 winds, wildfire. And this is a test case, a building they built, shown in that last slide where that half of it was built to kind of standard practice and the other half built to more fire conscious standards. And then they can expose it to these fire conditions. And you can see in the lower right, it's kind of hard to see, but in here there are embers being shot at the house. There's a ember generator. I don't know how they do that, but sort of blasting the house with these airborne embers in high wind. So examples, open eaves, pose a greater fire risk than if they're boxed in. Very significantly, wooden decks are a very high cause, a very common cause of structural fires in buildings. Open decks tend to accumulate a lot of debris, vegetation will grow under them and then die, leaves will accumulate. And then again, these embers, well in advance of a fire, land under that deck and catch it on fire and burn the house down. So, there are smart ways to do that. And there's some great resources. University of California, Berkeley has very good resources in Firewise Design. And it's not just the building, it's the way the landscape is managed to minimize fire risk. Landslides and mudslides, next issue we'll touch on here, or sometimes called debris flows. And this is very commonly a secondary impact of wildfire. So an area gets affected by a wildfire, and then weeks or months later, there's a heavy precipitation event, and the soils are destabilized because the trees growing on them have been killed or disturbed. And then you get these massive debris flows, like this one in Mendocino, California, that was very much in the news in 2018. I think there were maybe 20 people killed during that event. It came down very suddenly. We hear a lot about mudslides in other parts of the world, less developed nations, but they happen in the US as well. Fortunately, there are now some resources where the US Geological Survey is doing mapping of debris flow risk. This was an image I showed at a workshop that we participated in Malibu, California, after the wildfires there, developing strategies for the rebuilding that would happen, and how to make that, reduce the fire risk. So this map shown here shows, relative vulnerability to debris flows, but it's this is generalized a little bit. It's very specialized depending on the slope and the valleys and whatnot. But there is now, just within the last few years, much more focus on this by the U.S. Geological Survey. Some of the best guidance I've seen on managing for debris flows comes from Santa Barbara County, California, where Mendocino is located. This publication, it says it's about flood prevention and response, but really does a great job at addressing debris flows as well. And there are, pretty, I won't say easy, but straightforward ways to minimize risk with debris flows. By the way, the land is contoured to channel those debris flows away from houses. Next, I want to talk about temperature extremes. And when we're looking at disasters, surprisingly to a lot of people, it tends to be heat waves that kill more people than any other disaster. So it's a very serious issue. There was a widely publicized situation in 1995 in Chicago where close to 800 people died. Then in 2003, several tens of thousands of people died in Europe when a 2-week-long heat wave lasted. In Europe, the typical houses there were high mass buildings, and thermal mass can be great in terms of stabilizing temperatures over a period of time. But this heat wave lasted 2 weeks and it didn't cool down at night. Typically where mass buildings make so much sense, we have a big diurnal temperature swing and the mass cools down at night. If that doesn't happen, the temperature of those buildings can keep going up and up. And that's what happened in Western Europe. So there's a lot to learn from disasters like that. Last year we saw that just outrageous heat wave in the Pacific Northwest. There were places where the all-time record temperature was exceeded by more than 10 degrees Fahrenheit, which is just remarkable when you think about records going back 100 years or more. Normally records are broken by a degree or a fractional degree, but have records broken by 10 or 12 degrees is really extraordinary. And that, and a lot of that was in Canada, areas that don't have air conditioning or, usually don't have air conditioning. So, we need to be thinking about how to keep people safe in those buildings. There are, increasingly available projections of, what we're going to see in the way of more severe and longer duration heat waves in the coming decades. This is material, a map from climate.gov of US federal government information, that's mapped these vulnerabilities. And we're looking at in many parts of the country, a 2-fold increase in these extended heat waves, over the coming decades. Part of the solution for, increased heat, higher temperatures is design of our mechanical systems. This is our own home. And I think in my second or third slide, there was a photo of our house. I forgot to point that out, but a net zero energy retrofit of our 200-year-old home in southern Vermont. This is the interior, and we insulated the home well enough that we heat the entire house with just this single air source heat pump, which is right here, 18,000 BTU per hour air source heat pump or mini split. We don't have any heat upstairs. It's a central stairwell, and the upstairs bedroom rarely drops below 65, even in the winter. We do have a small wood stove, so we can supplement that air source heat pump when we need to. And we use that wood stove periodically. I think I went through maybe a third of a cord this winter so far, but it's fairly modest, and almost as much for aesthetic reasons as temperature reasons. But in the event of a power outage, and I'll be talking a lot more about that later, having that additional heat source is very important. Okay, drought and water shortage. This is another issue that's been in the news a lot. We see places like Lake Mead, the nation's largest reservoir, being at roughly half capacity in recent decades. We see places like Lake Lanier in Atlanta. This provides 90% of the fresh water for the city of Atlanta. And in 2007, the level got down to a 30-day water supply for the city with really no backup plan, if that water level dropped further. The governor famously urged people to pray for rain, and apparently that worked. It did start raining and recovered some of that reservoir, but it's a vulnerability that exists there, even in the east. And the West is much better prepared to deal with extended droughts. Lake Mead is a very deep reservoir that has several years worth of water, even if there are no additional inputs into it. The reservoirs in the east tend to be much shallower, much less storage capacity. There's a great resource, the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska. You can download these weekly drought maps of the US. The larger map here shows drought conditions in the US last week. The smaller map shows what they were a couple of years ago. And I showed the two maps just to show how much these conditions change. I was surprised to download this map the other day and see just how much drought there is in the West today and extending down into Texas. So in terms of what to do about drought, the first place is water conservation practices, low water use toilets and plumbing fixtures. Fortunately, the WaterSense program has really made that pretty easy for us. Simply buying WaterSense listed appliances and plumbing fixtures is a great place to start. You can go further. The toilet there is a 0.8 gallon per flush toilet made by Niagara. There are very good shower heads. The shower head on the upper right is one that I've used for years at 1.5 gallon, 1.5 gallons per minute flow, well below even the WaterSense requirement for water conservation. And then in dry areas, looking at landscaping. I can't say I really like the appearance of the landscaping shown there with different colored rocks, but it does use very little water. And I took that photo, by the way, that in the Phoenix area when I was on a bike trip in 2011, and not far from there was a development that had every house had a boat up dock, and the whole area was using water from the Colorado River for a kind of a resort community where people could keep their boats in Arizona. So, as the climate changes, there's some other effects that we tend not to think about too much. Insects moving north, termite ranges extending, into areas that didn't used to exist. There are mosquito ranges moving north that'll, bring various diseases that are borne by mosquitoes. And that calls, these, moving ranges call for paying attention to how we design our buildings to exclude insects. Certainly wood-boring insects, but we can also, look at screening systems. And Larson Storm Windows, a large manufacturer of storm windows and screens, has a great system with roll-down insect screening, where the screen rolls up into a valance at the top of the window. These are being installed at our house, where we have, it was a super insulated retrofit where we had the prime windows, which were double glazed low E argon, so good performing windows. But then we added low E storm windows on the exterior of that. So we have effectively triple glazing with 2 low E coatings. And those storm windows, the low E storm windows, have these integral screens that make it really easy to, from the inside to deploy those screens. Okay, I'm going to shift now to heat and, and specifically power outages and, what we need to do to focus on that. And this will, I'll spend really much of the rest of my remarks this afternoon on this idea of passive survivability. And that's the idea that we should be designing buildings that will keep their occupants safe in the event of loss of power. And, there are various news events we hear about, like the situation in Florida in 2017, where there was a storm event and backup power systems didn't work in this nursing home, and 14 people died from heat, elderly residents there. And we're seeing, even intentional power outages. This is part of Central California, showing where Pacific Gas and Electric, the state's largest utility company, proactively cut power to large parts of the state because of forecast high wind and wildfire potential. And PG&E had, faced extreme liability. In fact, had to declare bankruptcy because their power lines were blamed on some of the devastating wildfires we've seen in recent years. So they're now shutting off power when the risk reaches a certain level. And these tend to be times when it's very hot out, and all of a sudden people don't have access to their air conditioning. Similarly, but for very different reasons, Texas lost power extensively in February 2021 with that extreme heat wave that hit Texas, the polar vortex condition. Texas has this unique power grid. The US has 3 major major power grids, or ISOs: Eastern, Western, and Texas. Texas didn't want to be told what to do by the federal government in regulating power distribution. So they said, we're going to go it alone. So they've got their own power grid, and it failed miserably during that cold spell. The maps here show the percent of customers without power, and the darker purple there is 100% without power. The lighter purple, more like 50%. So pretty significant impacts. And that was at a time when temperatures were pretty extreme. A lot of people have electric heat, so there was a lot of hardship because those buildings weren't designed to function without power. And there is a lot of vulnerability in our energy grid, the both electricity, but also natural gas and other fuels that get transported around the country. A lot of people also don't realize that severe drought can put power production at risk. 89% of US electricity generation is with what are called thermoelectric power plants. These are power plants that use some heat source, whether it's natural gas or coal or nuclear or oil, to heat water, creating high pressure steam. And that steam has to be then condensed back into water. And so they require cooling water. And in a severe drought, if those power plants lose the cooling water, they shut down. And that extensive heat wave in Europe that happened in 2003 that I showed a map of, they lost, I think, 12 power plants because of loss of cooling water. So it can be, quite significant. And then with power loss, you have these cascading impacts, like, gasoline stations unable to pump fuel because they may not have backup generators. That's another issue that gets at resilience, but I'm not going to dwell on it this afternoon. So relative to the buildings, I talked about this idea of passive survivability. This graph shows typical residential buildings in New York City. And, looking at a row house, a brick low-rise building, brick high-rise, all glass high-rise, different types of buildings, and what happens based on thermal modeling when the power is cut. So this shows a 7-day period, and you can see the temperatures sort of trailing off and getting to within an unsafe temperature zone pretty quickly. This area like 50 degrees, that's a temperature where hypothermia can happen pretty readily and, putting people at grave risk. These are buildings that are, as built today, typical building stock. If instead we look at buildings built to, state of the art, or at least, pretty good energy standards, model energy code, the speed at which the temperatures decay is much more gradual. So those buildings, keep people safe for far longer. We can look at the same thing in summer conditions of losing power for a week. These are standard buildings, built to, existing building standards. You can see the all glass building, that diurnal, daily temperature fluctuation, the peak gets really high, really fast. A lot of these high-rise condos going up in New York City that are all glass, become uninhabitable within a matter of hours if power is lost. So there's a lot of concern there. And again, we can look at the thermal modeling if the buildings are built to, better energy standards. We can then go further and look at passive house design. This is a streetscape in Brooklyn, and you can pick out the house that was retrofit to passive house standards in this thermal imagery, where the oranges and yellows show a lot of heat loss from that building, and blue shows very little heat loss. And that building in the center is built to certified passive house standards. So in terms of achieving passive survivability, there are a lot of strategies that, you've been learning about here, I'm sure, and that have really been at the center of the green building movement for several decades now. And before that, the passive solar movement and the energy efficient construction movement, and it's smart building, it's high levels of insulation, it's high performance glazings, incorporating passive solar design with features like thermal mass and south facing glass. It's the way we orient the buildings, the design for natural ventilation, daylighting, specific strategies to reduce solar heat gain, like reflective roofs and minimizing glass on the east and west, where summertime overheating tends to be greatest. Smart things, common sense design standards that are hopefully now, more and more ingrained into building design today. And I think UMass's program of instruction is, very much involved with that and, very state of the art. So a lot of smart things about that. So the specific idea on passive survivability emerged out of work that I was involved with following Hurricane Katrina in 2005 that hit the Gulf Coast. We saw thousands of people being evacuated to the Superdome when their homes were flooded, and then a day later having to be evacuated from the Superdome because it was 110 degrees in there and 95% relative humidity. Similarly, older homes that weren't flooded but lost power, older homes did a lot better than newer homes. Homes built prior to the 1940s in the New Orleans area used vernacular architecture. That's architecture designed for that bioclimate. So they had features like wraparound porches that shaded the windows from direct sun. They were designed to channel breezes through the buildings. They often had higher ceilings to provide stratification within the house. And during Katrina, after Katrina, where some homes were without power for weeks, in some cases more than a month, those older homes tended to do better. So we reasoned with this series of design charrettes following Katrina. We knew that Katrina wasn't going to be the last storm that caused extended power outages. And shouldn't we be designing today and building today homes that do at least as well as the homes our grandparents were building? So that was the idea, and it became one of the 10 principles of the New Orleans principles of providing for passive survivability. And it really is what got me focused on resilience, because I saw this as a strategy for getting more people to do green building, as I mentioned at the outset. So in New York City, that's passive survivability has been looked at. I was part of a task force in 2004 that was looking at greening the codes, the building codes in New York City. And I pushed pretty hard for addressing this idea of passive survivability to ensure that buildings maintain reasonably safe conditions during power outages. And I think a place like New York City is particularly vulnerable with the popularity of all glass buildings that are, very vulnerable to summertime power outages. We didn't get very far in 2004. There was a recommendation to look into this issue. But then 3 years later, when Sandy happened, there was another committee put together that I was part of, the Building Resiliency Task Force. And this became one of 33 specific recommendations that came out of that to maintain habitable temperatures in buildings that lose power. And so that's out there as a strategy. It hasn't been implemented in building codes yet, but at least it's being talked about now, and it's seeing the light of day. We meanwhile worked on incorporating passive survivability into a suite of pilot credits we developed for the LEED rating system. That's leadership in energy and environmental design. LEED is sort of a metric for how green a building is. This building, for example, is certified to LEED Gold. There are different levels: platinum, silver, gold. And so we developed, the Resilient Design Institute led an effort to develop pilot credits looking at resilience. And we have this credit, and to develop that credit, we had to come up with a methodology for measuring what the passive survivability of a building would be. And it's a kind of complicated system that I won't go into here, but it became at least a placeholder, not only for defining, what the habitability zone in a building is. And we came up with 54 degrees to 86 degrees standard effective temperature, which is a somewhat different metric than air temperature. It's a metric that factors in relative humidity. Because if you think about it, a building at 90 degrees in Tucson is going to be way different than a building at 90 degrees in Atlanta due to the humidity. If it's low humidity, your body evaporates water and it cools you off. If you can't evaporate that moisture, health problems can ensue. So I'm really excited to report that, after I badgered the Department of Energy for years to really take this concept and put some teeth into it, or some meat on the bones, do the research needed to figure out if we were using the right methodology. There's now a working group that the Department of Energy organized with participation from 3 of the national labs, the National Renewable Energy Lab, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and Pacific Northwest National Lab. And I've been part of that committee that's been meeting for a year now. And here is just from a presentation a couple of weeks ago of the latest thermal modeling that they're doing. Somewhat to my frustration, they've sort of started with the assumption that, that 54 to 86 degree SCT temperature is the right, threshold of safety in buildings. I wanted, DOE or ASHRAE or someone else to really examine that with some physiologists. And, we need to, on the one hand, keep it simple, even though we recognize that the health condition of a person, their weight, their age, very much affect what becomes too hot or what becomes too cold. We need some way to define that if we're going to begin putting into building codes this idea of passive survivability. So it's out there. There's work being done on it, and hopefully we'll see some code language and other ideas coming out of that over the coming months. I'll end this afternoon with just a few quick images of a couple of 2 resilient buildings, or more resilient buildings that kind of tell a fun story. This is a home in far northern Quebec, an extreme climate. And we're talking over 10,000 heating degree days, Fahrenheit heating degree days, very high snow loads. And the owner of this home, a guy named Alan Hamill, had been through 2 major disasters. They were the first billion-dollar natural disasters in Canada's history, and both of them hit that area of northern Quebec. And he vowed that if he ever built a new home, he was going to build one that would keep him safe. So he built this pretty amazing house by our standards. Our 80 walls, our 64 floors, our 150 roof, triple glazed, dual low E, high solar heat gain coefficient windows throughout, tighter than passive house standards, double the snow load capability relative to the relevant code. In the interior, he used extensive thermal mass. He's got backup wood heat. He's got solar, electric, and battery storage. He kind of pulled out all the stops in creating what I, called the most resilient home in North America. So it's a kind of interesting case. The last project is a hospital in Boston, Charlestown, part of Boston, Spalding Rehab Hospital. This is a new building that was built 10 years ago or so. And it's right on the water, so they knew right from the start that there were flooding issues. You know, it's a spinal injury hospital, and water sports is a key part of their therapy. So they, valued that site on the water, but they went to pretty significant measures to protect the building from flooding. And very significantly, when the architects at Perkins and Will were first beginning work on this building, Hurricane Katrina happened. And they were reading in the news about, a hospital there where they weren't able to evacuate patients, and patient rooms got up to 105 degrees because the windows couldn't be opened and they lost power. And nursing staff were taking chairs to break windows to try to keep patients alive. So pretty dramatic, impact. And they took that to heart in designing Spalding Rehab. So I believe this is really the first modern hospital that has operable windows in every patient room, as well as all, meeting spaces and lobbies and, guest spaces. It's got triple glazing throughout the building. It's the spandrel glazing. Spandrel panels are much higher insulated than is typical. There's extensive exterior shading to keep out unwanted solar gain. They use spectrally selective glazing. And then the entire first floor of the building is, I think it's 30 inches above the 500-year flood elevation. But even so, the entire first floor is designed to be floodable. So they've got therapeutic pools, and pools are, well designed to get wet. But all the rest of the surfaces are tile or polished concrete. The glazing, the windows are fiberglass or aluminum, the frames. So it's, well designed to, keep the building safe. All of the mechanicals are on upper floors. The single biggest cost they had in achieving this level of resilience was bringing high voltage electricity up to the roof. Normally in commercial buildings, the utility company has a little building outside a commercial building where the utilities come into, the high voltage electricity, and then there are transformers to drop the voltage down to 220 and 110. In this building, they built a poured concrete chase to bring 13,000 volt power up to the roof. And there's a building on the roof that the utility company owns and has access to, and then that keeps it out of potential flood risk. There are two 275 kilowatt generators on one of the penthouse floors. They do have 2,000 gallons of fuel, of diesel fuel, stored in the basement, but that's bunkerized fuel, where the two sub-basements could be 100% flooded, and the storage tanks would still function. So, they really thought of, most everything. I since then visited the replacement hospital in New Orleans that was sort of the motivation for the features they used in Spalding. And I've got to say, I was disappointed in touring that veterans hospital that the resilience strategy they used there was just putting in massive backup generators and storing thousands and thousands of gallons of diesel fuel. They didn't really go to the level Spalding did in the building envelope. So that's it. We have a lot of information on the Resilient Design Institute website that is all available. And as students and faculty at the University of Massachusetts, you have full access to the Building Green library, which has content going back to 1992, and it's really been one of the the key resources in the green building movement. My wife Geraldine is in the back there and manages campus-wide accounts. So if anyone's interested in how to access that, feel free to chat with her when we wrap up. And so with that, thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions. I think I went on a little longer than I should have, but
No questions so far via Zoom.
How about you guys?
yes.
So thinking about when like electricity and the water things get shut off, it's just waste, a large part of these conversations as well.
Yeah, a great question. That question is, if electricity is knocked out and water supply is knocked out, what about wastewater? And interestingly, in the first effort to develop the lead pilot credit on resilient design, we looked at water, a resilient supply of potable water, but we didn't, have the time or wherewithal to dig into the wastewater side of it. And it's very significant. And that's an area where a lot of work needs to be done. And, there's some simple things that can be done. I mean, Geraldine and I live in a very rural area, and we built a composting toilet outhouse, that if we lose power and our water supply goes out, we can use that outhouse. And there are, some buildings, even commercial buildings, that are relying on composting toilets. And those continue to work just fine without power, without water. Some of them require foam flush toilets, which require a backup power source for resilience. But there are strategies, but it's one, it's a great point, and one that we need to look at a lot more closely. Yeah. Yeah, question, what about subway systems? I've been focusing this afternoon mostly at the building scale, but our infrastructure needs to also address these vulnerabilities as well, including subways. And subways, by their very definition, tend to be underground and very vulnerable. And we saw that with Sandy in New York City, where many of the subways flooded pretty extensively. And when you flood a subway where there are these electric subway cars that are using the third rail power, if it's salt water, which it is in New York City, that does a lot of damage. So there was extensive repair required for the subways. There are ways to help keep water out of subways, building closable gates, it's analogous to the dry floodproofing strategies I talked about for buildings, where a surround could be built at the subway entrance. And if the subway is going to be closed down due to flooding, that could be closed to keep some of that water out. And keeping out a couple of feet of water, may, address 90% of the risk. But it's one that, designers of subways need to be paying a lot more attention to than they have in the past.
No one else? All right. Well, Alex, I know you have your own water bottle. But we
Awesome.
hope you replace it with the coveted VCT water bottle.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl.